shudders around the world and the foreign policy elite here in September, last September? Well, there's a reason. Acheson was describing policy, and it's true, that is policy. It's been so for a long time. But the national security strategy last September proclaimed it as official policy, and that's quite a difference, an important one. Actually, you want to think about this. It goes back beyond that. You can find the policy described in the early stages of the Second World War, actually before the U.S. even entered it. There you can find a clear announced discussion of what's now called the Imperial Grand Strategy. So even before the U.S. entered the war, there were study groups of high-level planners from the Council on Foreign Relations, kind of the foreign policy elite, and the State Department trying to decide what to do in the post-war world. And they concluded that in the post-war world, the United States must hold, I'm quoting it now, must hold unquestioned power and must act to ensure limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that interfere with U.S. global designs. That's the September National Security Strategy. And they also recognized that the foremost requirement to secure these ends is rapid fulfillment of a program of complete rearmament. That's a central component of an integrated policy to achieve military and economic supremacy for the United States. That's 1940. At that time, those ambitions were limited to what they called the non-German world. They expected that Germany might win the European war, at least. And the non-German world was going to be organized under the United States rule as what they called a grand area that included the Western Hemisphere, the former British Empire, and the Far East. Well, shortly after that, Russia beat back the Nazi armies at Stalingrad, and it became fairly clear that Germany would ultimately be defeated, and these plans were then extended to include as much of Eurasia as possible, and they were implemented after the Second World War. They've been described since, as in Dean Acheson's comment, and now they're official policy. Well, that's all important to know. In a society that really valued its freedom, I wouldn't have to be saying this. Everybody would have learned it in high school. These are really important things to know about ourselves. There's plenty more like it. Well, let's go back to last September. One important development, which did cause plenty of concern around the world, foreign policy elite here, was the proclamation of the national security strategy. Something else happened in September. September was the opening of the political campaign for the midterm elections. And that was combined with an enormous propaganda campaign which began to present Iraq, Saddam Hussein, as an imminent threat to the survival of the United States, with insinuations that Iraq was responsible for the September 11th attacks. Actually, if you look at this morning's New York Times, Karl Rove, who's George Bush's minder, as they call him in Iraq, he describes it this morning. He says the goal is that in order to pursue the domestic agenda of the administration, it's necessary to frighten the population. You have to make the population feel that they have to shelter under, behind the powerful leader who's going to save them from destruction. You can do that. You can pursue your domestic agenda. Otherwise, not. He's talking about what we have to do what they're going to have to do in the future. But he also says, yeah, that's what they did in the past, and that's correct. In September, Condoleezza Rice showed up with her prediction that the next thing we're going to hear about Saddam Hussein is a mushroom cloud. They're planning to destroy us. And then there came a series of outlandish lies repeated passionately by Bush and others distributed quite uncritically by the media, and it had an immediate effect. You take a look at polls by September, after this campaign began, roughly 60% of the population believed it and continue to believe it. 60% of the population, plus or minus, believes that Saddam Hussein was an imminent threat. They got to keep repeating it to keep that level up. About half the population, about a month ago, it's probably higher now, believe that Iraq was responsible for the September 11th attack, that Iraqis were on the plains. Those beliefs turn out to be highly correlated with support for the war, and it's understandable. If you think that Saddam Hussein's an imminent threat, already destroyed the World Trade Center, planning something new, maybe a nuclear bomb, then it's understandable that you'd want to do something to get rid of him. That's a remarkable achievement of government media propaganda. You have to bear in mind that this is unique to the United States. Nowhere else where anyone believes anything like this, nor is it believed here by anybody who knows anything, like CIA or foreign policy analysts. But it has been imposed on the population. And that's impressive. It's not the first time, but it's impressive. As far as it was aimed at the election, and for the election it just barely worked. They barely managed to maintain control. Tens of thousands of votes, not much. And something similar is going to be needed for the next election. That's what Rove says this morning. It says for the next election we've got to create an image of George Bush as a powerful leader, a savior, who by then will be marching off to slay some new dragons. So it's going to be something to do next year. Well, for the guys in power, the current administration, all of this is kind of reflexive. It's just second nature. Remember that this is almost the same people who ran the country in the Reagan-Bush 1 administrations. They had 12 years to do it. It's sort of astonishing when you put yourself in the position of the Martian observer again, and recognize that it's just elementary sanity, if you want to figure out what these guys are up to ask what they did during their first tenure in power. It's 12 years, not ancient history. 1981 to 92, what'd they do? Well, it's interesting that it's almost never investigated. Do a search and see how often people bring up what they did the first time around. Well, if you do it, you'll find that right now they're following almost exactly the same script in detail. The first thing the Reaganites did when they came into office in 1981, first thing they did was drive the country into a deep deficit. Bush administration did exactly the same thing. This time, the way they did it was by a huge tax cut benefiting very tiny top percentage of the population, and by the biggest increase in federal spending in 20 years, quoting the Wall Street Journal. But it's a fact. Biggest increase in federal spending in 20 years, that goes to the rich. Huge tax cut for the rich. Well, that causes a problem, just as it did in the Reagan years. Got a deficit, you have to have what's called fiscal responsibility. Long, gloomy faces from the economic czars about fiscal responsibility. Fiscal responsibility means you got to cut services for the population. You got to cut benefits that help people. You keep the benefits to the rich. That's what the federal spending and a tax cut are about. Well, during the Reagan years, that's exactly what was done, and it was harmful. It was harmful even to economic growth, although there was some, but it was very harmful to the general population. It was 10 years of either stagnation or decline for most people. U.S. working hours went to the highest in the industrial world. For incomes either stagnated or declined. Working conditions declined. This was called a welcome development of transcendent importance by the Wall Street Journal, which tells you exactly what was going on. Well, it was highly unpopular, as you can imagine. There's a lot of mythology about Reagan's popularity. It's simply untrue. In fact, at the end, by 1992, he was ranked as the most unpopular living ex-president, right next to Richard Nixon, well below Carter and Ford. How'd they stay in power? Pressing the panic button every year, just what they're doing now. So they started right off with, it was recognized right away that Libya is a very convenient punching bag. It's completely defenseless. Everybody hates it. You can do what you want. So they started attacking Libya right away and presenting Libya as a threat. In 1981, Reagan was hiding in the White House because he had to be protected from Libyan hitmen who were wandering around the streets of Washington, and nobody could do anything about them. They were going to kill our leader. Well, somehow he escaped. Libya was trying to expel us from the world. He said nothing less than that. 2 years later came that air base in Grenada, which the Russians were going to use to bomb us. And then there was Nicaragua, 2 days driving time from Harlingen, Texas. Remember that? They were really close. And waving copies of Mein Kampf, according to the Secretary of State. A real threat. Reagan called a national emergency in 1985 to defend the country from the threat to the security of the United States posed by the government of Nicaragua. The Martian would be dying of laughter, I guess, but people here didn't laugh. In fact, if you look at that, that was renewed annually right through the 80s. You take a look at it, it's almost the same wording as the congressional resolution in October 2002 about the threat of Saddam Hussein. Imminent threat to the security of the United States. You've got to do something. In the 1980s, it meant a terrorist war against Nicaragua. Ended up with the U.S. had to defy the World Court. The Security Council continued. Destroyed the country practically. The other countries even worse. In 1988, George Bush was able to get elected, George Bush #1, but only by invoking the threat of black criminal rapists. Willie Horton, you remember that? That's how he got elected. Terrified everyone. There were crime frenzies, drug frenzies, just on and on. The international policies then were the same as now. The Reagan administration came into office in 1981, declaring that a war on terror would be the focus of U.S. foreign policy, a war against depraved opponents of civilization itself and a return to barbarism in our time, on and on. And it very quickly turned into a terrorist war. They devastated Central America, the Middle East. It was all over the world. The U.S. supported South Africa right through the 1980s. The Reagan administration had to find ways to get around congressional legislation calling sanctions. They were able to increase trade and support for South Africa right to the end. Just in the Reagan years alone, South African depredations in the surrounding countries, in Angola and Mozambique, killed about 1.5 million people. It's not small. That's when ends up with Colin Powell, the moderate, as National Security Advisor. In 1988, the U.S. declared Nelson Mandela's African National Congress to be one of the more notorious terrorist organizations in the world. That's part of the reason for supporting the South African apartheid regime. In 1987, December 1987, the U.S. voted against, that means essentially vetoed, the strongest UN resolution, General Assembly resolution, condemning terror in all its forms. It's the strongest resolution the UN has passed. U.S. voted against it. U.S. and Israel alone voted against it. The reason was it had a paragraph in it which said that though they condemn terrorism and have to do everything to stop it, nothing in this resolution prevents the people from struggling against racist and colonialist regimes or foreign military occupation. And the U.S. doesn't accept that. We don't think people have a right to struggle against racist and colonialist regimes and foreign military occupation. Racist and colonialist regimes referred to South Africa. Military occupation referred to Israel.